I'm Simpa Carter. I'm the chairman of Durham City Cannabis Club down in Durham in little old England. I'm the executive director at Hemp Garden Community Association, which is a community garden and public park that we have commandeered from the council for the past 8 years and have been converting into a multifunctional event space and community garden. We may or may not have also been growing cannabis publicly there for 4 years. But yeah, let's throw it over to Danny. He can introduce himself and we'll get going with this talk.
Hello everybody, I'm Danny Nemu. I live in Hastings, which is about as far south as you can get from here, so if you want to take the border all the way down, yeah, very welcome. Well, in this capacity, I was the ethics lead of Breaking Convention up until 2023, after which I was not, for reasons we might get into. My interest and fascination is with indigenous traditions and how they kept alive even earlier. Well, the traditions of safety, intelligent use of psychedelics that they have fostered, nurtured, and also the underground, how that kept those things alive and recreated a lot of those spaces, and interesting cosmologies around what happens to you when you're on psychedelics. And I'm very curious and quite skeptical about what's happening as capital and, as we're going to get into today, military interests are moving into the psychedelic space, and what the indigenous traditions and what the underground was looking after for a very long time is getting sidelined, pushed all the way to the side. I think we're in a neo-colonial moment where voices that should be heard are not really getting a lot of airtime. I watched Joe Rogan quite recently. He did a podcast with a right-wing governor and a military psychologist, and they talked about Ibogaine for over 2 hours, and they kept on talking about plant medicine. Ibogaine isn't plant medicine. It's like saying cocaine is plant medicine. That's why it says ain, not a at the end. Coca and iboga is plant medicine, but Ibogaine isn't. And these three managed to talk about Ibogaine for 2 hours without mentioning the word Africa once. And that seems to be kind of across the board with a lot of the kind of the movements, especially the well-funded ones. I don't know, I'd like to think this was a mistake, but I suspect it isn't. I suspect it's no more a mistake than the seizure of South and Central America was a mistake. So I think we're just going to chat. We've got a couple of hours, we've got a good chunk of time, and we were going to have more people here. So if any of you have questions, then feel free to rudely interrupt us, because otherwise it's just going to be us two nattering away endlessly.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good introduction. Let's flow a bit with this. Let's get a bit more of a biography on yourself, of kind of why you're interested in plant medicines, why and how did you get involved with Breaking Convention. I suppose it's not too controversial or contentious, maybe why you're not now. I think I'll give the audience a bit of a background on yourself before we jump into some of the subjects that I think we'd like to highlight.
Yeah, I started ranting before saying who I was. I was involved with the Santa Daime ayahuasca church, let's say, for 24 years. Lived in Brazil in the Amazon for a year, and I went to Brazil after drinking Daime's a ayahuasca lineage. It's a mixture of indigenous shamanism and some elements from the African, the kind of Afro-Brazilian tradition, and also folk Catholicism, and a few other things thrown in there as well. That all came together in a little part of Brazil, the border of Bolivia and Peru. And I lived there for a year. And the reason I went there was because I was curious to learn more about this particular lineage of ayahuasca use. I met some musicians when I lived in Japan. I lived in Japan for 6 years, and for 5 of those years I was drinking ayahuasca there. And that particular lineage is quite different to what you might imagine in an indigenous setting. Mestre Nemu, who was the guy who founded it, took ayahuasca from that context and made a collective ritual out of it. So in the jungle, traditionally, normally the shaman would drink on his own or her own, and then get instructions, and then share the instructions with whoever had come to them ill. And Mestre Nemu changed that format into a more collective work, and there's good reason to believe that if we go back all the way before the conquest of South America, that there were collective rituals with ayahuasca, as you have circle dances up in the North American tribes, for example. But what survived the conquest seems to be much more focused on, for example, healing rather than collective works. It's very difficult if you have authorities trying to stamp out a tradition to do big collective works, but it's quite easy for you to disappear off into the jungle for 6 months and do dieta, spend time with your plants, spend time with your own. And you can also see why that history of abuse and violence would have changed that tradition to be much more focused on healing than it might have been before. But we don't know what was before because we don't have written records of that kind of thing. So Daimi may well be a recapitulation or a way back to a more collective way of working with ayahuasca. Some people think of it as a colonial effort in itself, which undermines the ingenuity of people who live in that region to pull things together from the various traditions they have, and to talk to their spirits who are talking to them through their plants and through their dreams to create something. It's a very beautiful lineage, and I went to study it. I went to go write a book on it, which turned into 3 books, 2 of which are published. One's called Science Revealed, one's called Neuro-Apoclaypse. And yes, I went there with a mission to learn more about ayahuasca and to finish my books. And not long after I got there, probably about 3 months, I was out cutting ayahuasca vine, and I got bitten by a sandfly, and the sandfly bite turned into a spot, and the spot turned into a pimple and into a boil, and it turned out I had leishmaniasis, leishmaniosa, as it's called in Portuguese, which is a rather nasty protist infection. It formed a colony on my chest, and then I spent 8 months fighting this flesh-eating disease as it kind of grew, and I shrank. I lost 10 kilos in the process of it, and I also lost a set of rose-tinted spectacles on the world and on the psychedelic world. Where I lived had also had its own run-in with colonial forces, so a very traditional caboclo community. Caboclo is a mixture of indigenous people, black people, and Portuguese people from the various traditions. So it was a caboclo community, and all at the same time a whole bunch of things arrived, including the outboard motor and money and foreigners and people after petrol in the jungle, and all these kind of forces arrived. And so there I was, right on the frontier, and it's where the paste, which is kind of halfway between cocaine and crack, comes over the border as well. And as the roads have opened up, and as the logging has opened up, that trade has also flooded over the border and taken root in a lot of indigenous communities, a lot of the caboclo communities as well. So it was far from paradise where I lived. It was quite a dodgy place, but it was also an amazing place. I was in the jungle. And there I was for, 8 months ill. 5 months of that, I was drinking ayahuasca every day. And yeah, I learned quite a few things. It was an interesting moment because I went there in order to write my book and research this stuff. And then I had the perfect opportunity, but everyone was telling me I was going to lose the cartilage in my nose and the cartilage in your ears because it's quite an aggressive disease. People would say, look, I'm going to put you in the car and drive you around Rio Branco. You can see the old guys without noses because they didn't have the luxury of antimonium tartrate injections. Yeah, so in that course of those 5 months, I got really deeply ingrained into tradition that I was already very curious about. And one of the things that happened there was a profound love and respect for the understandings that those people have of those medicines, of that environment as well, because I wasn't just using that particular vine, I was using a whole load of other plants as well, and other kind of spiritual interventions from various different spirits, including a 400-year-old slave incorporated into the body of a medium. Anyway, it was a crazy moment. But I guess that's an important bit of my biography, and I lived out in Brazil for 2.5 years in total, and then came back to the UK. So I was involved in breaking convention from the very first one that happened. I talked about drugs in the Bible at that point, and today we're going to be talking about war and drugs. So maybe we should start there.
I think it was a good jumping off point there, talking about sort of colonial forces and kind of their impact on indigenous sort of drug use. You've obviously got, I suppose, I guess the British will have to take some sort of responsibility here with international sort of slave trade, etc. One of the things obviously we started to discover quite quickly was different compounds. Obviously our upper class has got quite a taste towards some of these compounds, and that started a several hundred-year cascade of, were you allowed to swear? What's the etiquette here? You can swear fuckery that is still continuing on to this day. So yeah, let's go. What's the earliest example we've got in war in your notes or in your repertoire?
Oh right. Well, if we can go back to before we were human. Really, there's a few things that all humans everywhere have done, and one of those is war, and one of those is drugs. And war is, in fact, it goes back to before humans, organised collective violence. Chimpanzees engage in something that looks very much like warfare. They will patrol the edges of their territories silently and in single file, and they will ambush members of rival chimpanzee troops. There was one war that was documented by Sally Goodall, where it ended after about a 4-year war, and it ended after all of the males of one group had been annihilated and the females had been taken. So, yeah, chimpanzees involve themselves in war. They also have an understanding of their local plants. Chimpanzees do all kinds of interesting things with medicinal plants, potentially even practicing a form of birth control with plants that are useful for that as well. But they don't, or at least we don't have any evidence of them fighting whilst they're high. But we do for gorillas. Gorillas tend to be quite peaceful creatures, really, despite their ferocious look. And when an alpha male is getting tired, the troops are controlled by a single alpha male. When he's getting tired, looking a bit like he could be knocked over, then a younger male will go, and this has been observed, eat some iboga root, wait for the effects of the iboga to kick in, and then go and make a challenge, which is pretty interesting. Iboga is a stimulant, among other things. I kind of want to talk about psychedelics and drugs more generally without the constraints of the pharmaceutical language that we have. So yes, it's a stimulant, but that's not what they say in the jungles of Central Africa. I was talking to a Babongo gentleman a couple of months ago in preparation for this. Babongo is one of the pygmy lineages, and they say that they learned the use of iboga from the animals, particularly from the porcupine. But there's different stories there. And in their culture, they have different strains of iboga, and they're used for different things. But we tend to think of iboga in this country, and I mean, the US military is really interested in it for treating stress, treating addiction in particular. In the Babongo culture, in the Fang culture, these tribes people will use it in a number of different ways. They use it in initiation rites, which I've had the pleasure of taking part in. Actually, it wasn't a pleasure, it was horrible. But it was useful. I don't think I would have written any of my books if I hadn't done that. I'd been smoking weed every day for about 13 years at that point, unless I didn't have any, at which point I was looking to smoke weed. And I wasn't even particularly trying to stop. I didn't think that was a problem. But when I took iboga, it became clear that it was. And so it's very good for breaking habits. And in fact, in those contexts, it's used as a coming of age thing when you're not a little boy or a little girl anymore, you become an adult. And one of the things that adults do that children don't do is they know when to stop. So it's very good for that, but the picnic also use it for hunting, among other things. And a lot of psychedelics are used for hunting. You see it in the Amazon as well. And very adjacent to hunting is warfare. Now, warfare in the jungle tends to be ambush, often. And if you can second guess your opponent's movements, either because you have heightened sensitivity, or because you have an astral connection into their dreams, you know where they're going to be tomorrow, then you have an advantage in warfare. And that's how these things are used in those contexts. So they have iboga strains which are to turn you into an animal, and they have iboga strains that are to make you invisible. That's one that you really see very commonly in literature, different plants that make you invisible. For example, sassafras. Sassafras was put to great use by a woman called Nanny of the Maroons, who fought the British Empire in Jamaica in the early 1700s. And she used to, among other things, steep bracelets in sassafras and some other things, and the bracelets were to make you invisible. And if you imagine the context of jungle warfare, if you can see the other guy before he can see you, then you're pretty much invisible. Sassafras is used traditionally to improve your eyesight. It's a central nervous system tonic, and one of the muscles it improves is the muscles that hold your lens, so that can make it sharper. When I was living in the Amazon, I met this guy once. He was a Swiss guy, older than me, and he was a mercenary. He'd arrived in the region as a mercenary soldier, and he'd been training with the Bolivian army with ayahuasca, and he said it was amazing because you could just kind of tell where your enemy was in the jungle. One of the ways that you know where your enemy is in the Amazon. In the Amazon, I probably couldn't see you. You can see as far as the nearest tree in the Amazon. In our culture, we tend to have a very visually skewed culture, and our psychedelic culture is those kind of images and crazy shirts. But it's a much more aural, much more hearing culture in the jungle because there's lots of noises and you can't see very far. And if your enemies are waiting over there, then the birds won't be singing over there. So you can hear the absence of noise. It's one way you can tell where people are. There are traditional cultures in the Amazon who only use ayahuasca for hunting. And the way they do it is the night before, the shaman will drink and see. And what he'll see, or she will see, is where the animals are going to be tomorrow. And they'll make a deal with let's say the mother of that particular animal, and they'll say, okay, you can take 3 of us tomorrow, and we're going to meet you by the river at 6 o'clock in the morning, or at sunrise. And then you'll go and find them. So that's very, very similar to the strategy of an ambush as well. So we see psychedelics in the Bible. I'll stop rambling in a second, actually. We have, if you go back to our earliest books, Exodus 30 has a couple of sections on different psychedelics that are used, or different, there's an incense, it's the temple incense, or Ketoret HaSamim, the incense of drugs, that's what Ketoret HaSamim means. And the anointing oil, the word in Hebrew for the anointed one is Mashiach, and that means the word Messiah comes from that. The Messiah is the anointed one. So the guy who was smeared with ointment was the Messiah, and it was a king or and also the priests who were smeared with this oil, and this oil contains 4 ingredients. It contains cinnamon verum, cinnamon cassia, myrrh, and cannabis. And those 2 first ones, cinnamon verum and cinnamon cassia, between them inhibit all of the cytochrome enzymes in your body that break down drugs. A little bit in the same way as ayahuasca has an enzyme in it, which will be inhibited by harmonies and beta-carbolines, so the DMT can get to your brain. I'm simplifying a little bit, but that's the story that Terence McKenna told anyway. Those monoaminoxidase inhibitors inhibit those enzymes so the DMT can get to your brain. And something similar happens in the anointing oil of Exodus 30. So you have those two varieties of cinnamon that inhibit the cytochrome enzymes, which break down 99% of the drugs that get into your body. And then you've also got myrrh, and you've also got cannabis. And myrrh in itself is a sedative, but myrrh's got stuff in it which is structurally very similar to mescaline. And we tend to, well, the body normally breaks it down before it gets to your brain, so it doesn't do all the crazy things to you that mescaline does. But if you have those enzymes inhibited, then it will get to your head. So that can make a very, very super psychoactive mix. So much so that it can give you the experience of Yahweh, which is what that anointing oil is supposed to do. And it says in the Bible, lines like, and Samuel anointed him in the midst of his brethren, and the spirit of Yahweh came upon him from that day forward. Right? So that's the point of it. It's supposed to introduce a king to the tribal god, and also the priest to the tribal god, because the kings and the priests were the juncture point between the deities and the people, right? And as a tribal god, Yahweh is a war god. He's described as a war god in the Bible. That's one of his jobs, is to make you, and this is what he says to Moses, I'll make you love your brothers, and I'll make you hate your enemies. And the kind of advice that Yahweh is giving all the way through the book of Exodus is the kind of advice which has been given to shamans by their spirits since the dawn of time, because the shaman's job is to look after the tribe against any kind of threat they might face. And that might be, for example, the example I gave you before, finding game animals so you can hunt them and eat them, so protecting the tribe from starvation, finding water, predicting the weather, sorting out conflicts within the tribe, right? That's still what ayahuasca is used for these days. There's a wonderful organisation called Umiyak, which is working in the Kofani territory. Kofani and two other tribes. These tribes have been at war for as long as anyone can remember, and they're kind of uniting to face the petroleros, the people who are wanting to extract petrol from the place. So this organisation in the Ash is organising ayahuasca sessions between people whose grandfathers have been killing each other in local tribal wars. So it's very good at resolving conflicts between previously warring people. But ayahuasca and divination, whether it's with psychedelics or whether it's through dreams or whatever it is to protect your tribe from disease, for example, would be another one. And there's plenty of examples of that in the Bible too, where there's a disease, and Moses goes or Aaron goes and asks Yahweh what it is, puts the anointing oil on, sits in a bath of smoke in the Holy of Holies, which is a 4.5 meter cube hot box in the back of the tabernacle, with 4 skins over it, and a thick veil at the front so none of the smoke can escape. And then there's 16 different resins which are burned on a censer, and 12 of them are psychoactive. Things like labdanum, frankincense is in there, galbanum is in there, eggnog is in there, oud. All of these things work on the GABA system and the dopamine system. Spikenard's in there, which boosts your memory. Anxiolytic, a whole bunch of things. Anyway, he would sit in a cloud of this stuff after being anointed with that stuff and talk to Yahweh between the angels on the top of the magic box inside there. And the angels would tell him, in this case it is only him, where to find water, for example. So there's a story of Moses striking the rock with a stick, story of divination, dousing for water. But also military maneuvers, and this is one of the things that shamans have been required to do for as long as we have records. Right? When is the other tribes going to attack? When should we attack them? When should we sue for peace? That kind of thing. So that goes back, I mean, Babylonian astrologers were doing the same thing. John Dee, for example, in England, who was in many ways responsible for the British Empire, which we've got a lot to say about. According to, he was using all kinds of plants in his divinations with the angels, and according to his diaries, he whipped up a storm which destroyed the Spanish Armada when it was on the way. So yeah, we've been using magic in warfare for a very, very long time.
Wow, covered a great deal of subjects there. But I think you did quite well there. You bring us from sort of our prehistory into sort of, you know, early organisations, and then into mass sort of, or the early adoption of globalisation, you know, cultures moving around and imposing themselves on others. So everything we've sort of spoken of so far has been kind of localised, as it were. We then move into an era, as you kind of touched on, both out of the British Empire. It was like called an empire, because without cannabis it wouldn't really happen. Like I alluded to earlier, so then we're moving into a monoculture of drugs over the past, say, 500-600 years. Yeah, do you have a jumping in point for sort of around this area? I'm just trying to sort of build it into a timeline of where we currently are, and then we can kind of play with that.
Yeah, it's a long time then, isn't it? I guess one of the things I'd like to, monoculture, that's interesting. It's got one of the hallmarks of our current culture is that it's kind of mono, or at least it's got designs on mono, and back in the day the Israelite religion wasn't monotheistic, it was, they call it monolatristic, monolatry, which is a bit like a kind of monogamous paganism, where you acknowledge the existence of other gods, but you're into your god more than them, which is what you have in the Bible, thou shalt have no other god before me. Right? It doesn't say there are only other gods, and you know, I am a jealous god. Well, what are you jealous of, mate? So that kind of monotheism comes a bit later, when the Israelite culture is destroyed by the Babylonians. And they have a different system. They've got a Zoroastrian-inspired, a good god and a bad god. And the conqueror there, well, they get conquered, and then the Babylonians get conquered by the what became the Persian Empire. And they have this Zoroastrian good guy and a bad guy. And the good guy is identified with Yahweh. And in fact, Cyrus, who is the conqueror of the Babylonians, is identified with the Messiah. So he's the first non-Israelite who the Israelites call the Messiah, because he liberates the captives who've been taken to Babylon. And then he sends them back to Palestine, and they rebuild the temple, but they've been rebuilt in a different way. If you look at let's say the cultures of Africa, you could look anywhere really, but focusing on the Zulus before Shaka Zulu. So Shaka Zulu in the 1800s expanded the Zulu Empire and changed the way that warfare was conducted. But before that, they conducted a kind of warfare, although we might not recognise it as warfare. Like I said at the beginning, one of the things which we've been doing ever since the beginning of history is making war against each other. I mentioned the chimpanzees who do it in a rather ugly way, and then you've got the bonobo who do it in a rather beautiful way. In fact, they don't really go to war. The women look after things in bonobo society, or they're not women, are they? The female bonobos. And when there's testy relationships with next door neighbours, they trade sexual favours, which sounds like a much better idea.
What do you mean by trade? Like they get it off them as payment, or they give it as what do you mean they trade?
Yeah, that's a really good point actually. So you're right, it's not really, it doesn't look like it's very transactional in a way that we might think of, maybe the way that kings were swapping their daughters to each other. So no, I think they just kind of get amongst it and chill out. That's what it looks like to me. Maybe I'm projecting my desires into that species. So the way that humans have warred when they become sophisticated about it is very, very ritualized. So take the Central African tribes. What they would do is they would have pre-arranged meetings at the edge of their territories. And in the days before this, the the shamans, the seers, would take plants, like, for example, African dream root, which is an REM modulator. It changes how you do rapid eye movement sleep. And in their dreams, they would then receive omens, and the omens would then be played out on what I'm going to call the battlefield. But it's very different to what you might imagine a battlefield is like. And then, as the tribesmen were preparing for these meetings at the edge of their territories, they would take a bunch of other things. They would take, for example, African ginger, which is I think it's a GABA modulator, something like that. Yeah, it's a GABA modulator, it's a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which gives you energy and boosts your morale. And they'll be drinking sorghum beer as well. That one's really interesting because it's a beer, obviously, so it's alcoholic, but there was a study done on a Nigerian traditionally produced sorghum beer, and they found a whole bunch of different ergots in it, because sorghum is one of the few plants which ergot grows on in a non-toxic way. Yeah, so ergot, if you eat it off rye, for example, it can do awful things to you. If you drink it off sorghum in the right dose, it can certainly put a sheen on stuff. Ergot contains LSA, which is a cousin of LSD. It's what LSD was synthesized from originally. They'll be smoking or fumigating themselves with helichrysum. Helichrysum odoratissimum, great word. Very, very smelly. Which purifies their bodies before they go into battle. And it's also a GABA modulator, makes you feel good. And then during the battle, they'll be smoking and chewing canna, which is Sceletium tortuosum, which is a dopamine booster and gives you euphoria and courage. And they'll also be sniffing tobacco before, during, and afterwards. Right? So there's a whole lot of drugs involved. But the actual fighting is extremely ritualized. The men would arrive in full regalia, they would sing and they would dance, and then they would display their power by throwing the spear as far as they could. And they would display their agility by dodging the spears that were coming back. And very few people got injured in these situations. And in fact, when someone did get injured, the first bloodshed, that was the end of the battle. Or they would finish up the battle when they ran out of spears. Yeah? And it looks like the people who got hurt were the really foolhardy, or those without skill, but they were really trying not to hurt each other, but still display their prowess, display their power. It's got to be quite scary when you've got, spears raining down upon you. So you have these highly ritualized systems of engagement, or cultures of engagement, where men can blow off their steam and do their dance and receive their omens, and it's a kind of edgy ritual theatre. But I live by the Wetherspoons, so I see the most unsophisticated displays of ridiculousness. Monday night there's people threatening to stab each other. I have a feeling that men are just going to do this until the end of time. And sometimes they do stab each other, sadly. And sometimes they form, militaries, and they go and cause genocides on each other. But these guys had a beautiful, sophisticated way of doing it. And you see this in other cultures as well. Amongst the Lakota Indians, the Plains Indians, there's a group called the Oglala, and I hope I'm not butchering that name too hard. And there was a missionary who was staying with them, and he said about them that their wars, they fought neither to enlarge their domain nor destroy a people, but to wipe away the blood of a relative or to gain renown. Right? So they're going to war, and the most valorous thing you could do, the most brave thing you could do, is run up and touch one of the enemy with a wooden stick called a coup stick. And that was called counting coup. So if you could run up, hit the guy, and run away, then you're the Don. You can enter warrior societies. You can, I assume, wear special feathers and do special dances, get all the ladies. I don't know what happens when you come back from that. When Black Elk is talking in his biography about this is a much later period when they've already been displaced quite a lot. There's already guns have come into the culture. At that point they're collecting scalps, right? Which sounds pretty vulgar, collecting scalps. But if the idea of your warfare is to go and get a few scalps, which you're then going to venerate, you know, you go and you get a scalp and that's a win for the whole tribe, rather than you go and kill a ton of people and burn down their village. It seems like they were doing it a little bit better. And in fact, there's no evidence of siege warfare in Indian Plains battles, even when they were actually using edged weapons rather than blunt weapons. A lot of the time they used blunt weapons. And they would pause for ceremonial fasts. And so there's a whole lot of drugs involved there as well. Peyote, for example, in the, what they call the Lipan culture, they would take peyote beforehand for their dreams, for their divination. They would use it during battle to stop bleeding, and they would use it afterwards to treat ghost sickness, which sounds a little bit like, well, I was going to say it sounds a little bit like PTSD. I have a problem with the word PTSD, because feeling sorry because you killed someone or witnessed a massacre is not a disorder, that's being human. Yeah, so they would use peyote to deal with ghost sickness, which I think is a better word for it. The Oglala would use Jimson weed, which is datura, it's one of the daturas, beforehand, and they would use sweet flag, which is calamus, Acorus calamus, which is, you quid it normally, and we have that here. It's a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and gives you energy and morale. So there's certain periods, and it seems like after the introduction of horses and after the introduction of guns, things get a bit more testy, and things are a lot more mobile. There's a premium on scalps at that point. So scalping changes in its context, because basically the Americans, or the pioneers, are wanting to wipe out the Indian people, so they're collecting scalps and making money for scalps. So back to the question of monoculture and polyculture, there were ways of maintaining the existence of your neighbours, maintaining a sustainable relationship with your environment, including your neighbours, which would leave everyone alive, or nearly everyone alive, until you have this colonial movement. And now I don't want to be oversimplistic here. There are moments in history, like the Babylonians did establish an empire without any help from whitey, you know, and they had slave trade and all that kind of thing. So I don't want to romanticize the ancient world, the indigenous world. But in our particular iteration of slavery and domination, when we had colonial forces moving into, for example, South Africa, putting those places under pressure, introducing guns, collecting slaves. So a tribe that could capture slaves then had an economic reason to actually go beyond the boundaries of those ceremonial wars. And one of the guys that did this was Shaka Zulu. So Shaka Zulu banned the throwing of spears, and he made the spears shorter. And he said, what you're going to do is, you're not going to throw your spears, you're going to run up and then you're going to stab them with your spears. Yeah. And the reason Shaka was so successful was because they didn't know what to hit them. Like, this was so alien to African culture at that point. It's like, what the hell are you doing? You're running up here and, you know, stabbing us in the liver. You're not meant to do that. You know, you're meant to dance in front of your friends, display your valor, and then go home and smoke something pleasant. Yeah. So yeah. In the context of monoculture, it really does up. It really jumps with a couple of different monoculture or monotheistic or kind of monomaniac cultures, including the Babylonian and then including, eventually the British, which was the biggest empire the world's ever seen.
So far. Some brilliant points again. You worked off the kind of crumb that I threw you there. Wasn't a really good phrasing of the question, but it's exactly what I wanted to sort of move through the timeline and speak of you, as you spoke of the diversity of expression by sort of subcultures around the world. And then, I mean, I can't remember which tribe it is, but there's a term wetico. Have you heard that before?
Yeah.
And wetico, it sort of describes like this sort of cannibalizing impulse, not of the flesh, but of like the soul and of the spirit and like the natural world, and sort of the Native Americans spoke of when the colonizers arrived, the Europeans. They didn't see nature as something to synergistically live amongst this, or as something to sort of dominate, and then you got like manifest destiny and all that kind of thing, which is a complete branch of topics that we're not going to speak on today. But then, yeah, exactly, the monotheism as well, this kind of idea of a struggle for a kind of global, singular God that in some ways paid lip service to acknowledgement of other beliefs, but ultimately it was, no, you'll get it. In a couple of years, you'll get it. We'll just put enough pressure. We'll arbitrarily draw some lines on the map, and you guys have been warring forever. You know, buddies, you're the same thing. And expected it all to go down nice and easy. So yeah, I think good time sort of jumping into what kind of happens with the British. I mean, it's not just the British, obviously, it's the Europeans sort of moving out to colonize the world and discovering, you know, this magic and kind of the discrimination and the bigotry that was approached there of these kind of, you know, early Christians kind of going, well, what the hell do you mean that you speak with spirits and ghosts and animals tell you where water is?
Yeah, interesting. There's, so the cultures that move tend to get more brutal the less Christian they get, and I'll explain what I mean there. For example, the Amazon, where you have the Spanish and the Brazilians, Portuguese, who were making incursions into the jungle there. There was a tradition called the correo, which is where basically slaves were taken from those places by the Spanish. And after a while, the Catholic bishops and priests heard about this. They said, "No, you can't be doing that." You know, the Pope himself said that the savages were like children who should be educated, rather than like animals that should be exterminated. Right. So this is a progression. And so you have a really interesting bit of history in Brazil, where I used to live on the border there, where you have priests that are going to baptize indigenous people, and then the word goes along the rivers amongst the indigenous people. They say, like, you've got to get yourself down to this guy in a dress, because he's going to sprinkle some water on you, and then they're going to stop killing you, and they're going to stop branding you and taking your property. So there's a really interesting, quite fraught and layered story of salvation through the cross there. But you can tell by the colour of the people, the colour of the culture in Latin America, that although a lot of people got wiped out, isn't quite wiped out everybody. The Protestant cultures are much better at that. The Dutch East India, well, the Dutch, when they were in Japan, for example, they were quite happy to stamp on their crucifixes and stuff like that. The East India companies, the Dutch and the English East India companies, they had a different god. Adam Smith talks about the invisible hand, and he's talking about capital there. And he's the guy behind the opium wars. But we'll get to that in a minute. The first corporate massacre was in 1621, which was also over a drug, actually. It was the Banda Islands, which were populated by some probably quite happy people who lived amongst nutmeg on, I think it was 6 or 7 islands. And in 1621, they were pretty much wiped out by the Dutch East India Company in order to monopolise this substance, which was seen as a panacea for everything. It was imported in huge quantities, fetched extreme prices, and is very, very psychoactive. And I must warn you not to take too much of it, because it's just nutmeg. It's nutmeg. So go very slowly with nutmeg, because if you get the dose wrong, it'll give you a stonky headache for days. But anyway, the British and the Indian and the Dutch fought over those islands, and eventually in 1677, the Dutch swapped Manhattan Island for the last of the Banda Islands. So the British got Manhattan Island, the Dutch got control of the nutmeg trade, but then the British ended up stealing some anyway and cultivating somewhere else. The opium, or rather the East India Company, was run on tea. The men had their rations of tea, it kept them alert, kept them vigilant, and it was their campaigns were financed by tea as well. And so there was a kind of three-way, there was a trade of tea and opium. And when China decided it wanted to ban the use of opium, Adam Smith didn't like that at all. He's a guy on a £20 note. So he basically called the start of the Opium Wars, which was forcing the Chinese to eventually to legalise the opium trade. Then, you know, down through the 1800s, war gets worse and worse and worse. And drugs, from, you know, at the beginning, they are mainly used for divination and for valour on the battlefield, and they never become an economic resource. In World War II is, at the beginning of World War II, people are still doing divination with plants. Winston Churchill, well, not with plants actually, Winston Churchill was in the Boer War, and he escaped Boer prison and found his way to a safe house using a planchette pencil, which is a spiritualist technique, a bit like a Ouija board. And Nixon said of him that he was the only world leader that still had a crystal ball. So he was quite down with that. And then the Nazis, they were really into the occult. And there was a guy who predicted an assassination attempt on Hitler in Ernst Kraft, thank you very much. He said that between the 7th and 10th of November 1939 there was going to be an assassination attempt, and indeed on the 9th of November there was an assassination attempt. This guy got picked up by Himmler, brought into the propaganda unit, the Institute of Occult Research, and he was set to work on deciphering Nostradamus. Himmler also commissioned SS officer Otto Rahn to find the Holy Grail, and he did his visionary sessions with hashish in order to do that. But then something goes wrong. In 1941, there's a guy by the name of Rudolf Hess, who was quite high up in the Nazi command, and his astrologers and diviners and occultists advised him that it was a good idea to steal a plane, fly to Britain and try and negotiate a truce, because the Eastern Front was opening up and he didn't want to be fighting a war on two fronts. And this was a terrible failure and a big embarrassment for Hitler. So Hitler then banned astrologers and most occult practices, at least in the open. But before that, you know, Himmler was really into it. So this is the first time that divination actually gets taken out of warfare. I mean, it's declining and declining, but the idea of getting information from the gods in war, it kind of ends there, at least in Europe. But about the same time, Hitler starts to use drugs in a different way to get information. The first time he does this is in 1939. I think it's 1939, when he interrogates, or he has one of the suspects in that assassination attempt. It's called the Beer Hall assassination attempt. He has him interrogated with the use of Pervitin. Pervitin is methamphetamine. It was so they started to use drugs to get information, not from the gods, but from prisoners. Then there's, so first with that guy, then scopolamine with a couple of Soviet paratroopers in 1941, and then between 1941 and 1943, there were a whole lot, 1939 and 1943, they were giving spies barbiturates and a whole load of things like that. And at Auschwitz, there was a barbiturate, morphine, and sulfonamides project to use it as a truth serum. And then afterwards at Dachau, Hitler got really paranoid. He was paranoid anyway, for reasons we're about to get to. But he got very paranoid, but they kept on trying to kill him, basically. And then a briefcase blew up in a room that he was in, another assassination attempt in 1944. And then Himmler really ramped up the truth serum research. And they were using mescaline in Dachau. And it looks like they're using LSD. But we're going to come back to that story in a minute.
I was just going to ask you, sorry, I'm on the stream, it's like I also had a podcast, so I'm just kind of listening here as well and chiming in. Do you think sort of the mass popularisation of morphine on the battlefield in the American Civil War sort of marked the turning point? Because prior to that it was performative, it's ranks, it's rows, it's jobs and function. You fire your arrows, we put up our shields, you bring your charges, we do. It was something that could be devised through drugs. I can't pronounce the word that you were using before. Divination, now I can immediately. It then became far more about then projecting almost a false tactic. Then thinking about screwing the other over again, their expectation is we'll do this, like you were saying about again, the guy's name escapes my brain, in Africa, have shown in the spears changing the form of war. Morphine then is a drug, whereas prior to the things that we're using sort of as battlefield anesthetics, we were using things like alcohol. You know, you'd have that liquid courage as a motivator, you'd use it then as a cleanser, you'd use it when you were trying to like saw off a leg. But then once we got like a hypodermic needle in the mid-1800s, and the standardization of sort of morphine, given that, you know, opioids are sort of the advanced mood, or amplify mood. So if you're on a battlefield and dying, whereas prior interventions you were then given something that, you know, you were seeing God, you were seeing your ancestors, you were dying with that pride, with that valor, and that's when you were having this darkness kind of emerge upon you on the battlefield. And then from that point on, the commodification of drugs in warfare were more to increase efficiency rather than, you know, the berserkers of Norse tradition, you know, trying to get in Valhalla or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. The opioids, they kind of take you out of where you are. And you know, we'll come to it in a minute, but they make for extremely bad decision making in war. There was an article, a study rather, on opioid use in the US, and it said I think you're like 90% more likely to kill someone if you're on opiates. Right? There's something there about the dissociative power of it, because you're just not involved, and the things that you're doing don't really hurt that much, which is why they're so pleasant and dangerous as well. But I think there's something there, you know, like they were used a lot in Napoleon's campaigns, and Napoleon was very blasé about his campaigns. He said, "No one can defeat me. I spend 30,000 lives a month." That was how he thought about his men. And you're right, you know, it's artillery and it's long-range gunfire. When the gun was introduced to the Oglala tribe, or when it was in the area, they didn't take it to battle because it was useless. Because you can't display your valor with a gun, and it's, you know, it's a really dangerous thing that gives you nothing except blood on your hand. So yeah, I think there's something in that. And then like opiate use was really taken to a fine art by the Nazi high command, along with meth. So in the 1930s, you had these German pharmaceuticals companies. You've got Merck, for example, is one of them still around today. This is a whole kind of better living through chemistry era. In 1935, that was coined by DuPont Chemicals. But they're making explosives and they're making drugs. And one of the ones is meth, or Pervitin. They called it the Volksdroge, which means the drug of the, like Volkswagen, the Volksdroge, the drug of the folk. And you know, busy mothers were taking it, and women going on dates were taking it. It was really popular. Opium they didn't like. They said that it was Jewish doctors who were prescribing opium, and it was Jews who had to calm their excited nerves with opium. And in fact, the war on drugs was the term, well, I'm going to butcher the German, but the term was a German term originally. And it was a war on Jewish doctors who were prescribing drugs, among other things. And then, interestingly, when Nixon takes over the war on drugs, he also takes over the racism, and he says, you know, something along the lines of, you know, all these people trying to legalize cannabis, why are they all Jews? Yeah, but meth, they were really into meth, the Nazis. They produced 34 million tablets of it before the invasion of Poland. And
it's in like 3 months as well, like 3 month time frame.
Yeah, like German manufacturing was pretty good in the 30s, I think it still is. And it floods your system with dopamine, and it fills you up with confidence and bravado, and it doesn't really last. And that's what you find with the Third Reich. They do really well in Czechoslovakia, but they didn't expect anyone to jump to the defense of Poland, as in Britain and France, the biggest economy and the biggest army in the world. And they did. So the Nazis overran Poland really quickly. There was an officer who was on Pervitin as well, who said, it was great, I could negotiate with the Russian generals for 3 days and 3 nights straight over the partition. There was a ration of 2 to 5 pills per Panzer driver, when they invaded the Ardennes, when they invaded Belgium. So what happens after the invasion of Poland and the destruction there? The French and the English, they're knocked down with this, and then Hitler's in trouble because he's got a tiny army, or a small army anyway, and there's really not much he can do. And then someone comes up with a ridiculous idea: let's go across the Ardennes, let's go across this forested, mountainous region and cut Europe in half. And the only way you can actually do that is by not sleeping. And no one imagined that you could get through, days and days and days without sleeping. But of course you can if you've got meth. So that's what they did. And in 1939, they rushed this Belgian defensive position in the Ardennes, and the Belgians ran away, terrified. And then they stormed across Belgium in record time. So you have Rommel, for example, Rommel, who was leading the panzer divisions. I think he took, 240 kilometers in one day, which is a military record that's never been equalled. He was driving as fast as he could on a tank, faster than his orders could keep up with him, mashed on death, thinking he was invincible. And they took more territory in 100 hours than they took in the entire First World War. That was blitzkrieg, but blitzkrieg wasn't a tactic that they sat down and said, let's do blitzkrieg. What happened was they had tanks and they had meth, and they just went for it. And they went all the way to Dunkirk, and they pushed the Allies. The French had a ration of from a quarter to half a litre of red wine per day. And the Nazis had 2 to 5 meth pills, right? So you can see how that was going to go. The British Expeditionary Force got pushed all the way to Dunkirk, and they were about to be absolutely mashed. And the French generals were terrified. Everyone was terrified. And then Göring visits Hitler at his territory. And Göring takes a massive dose of morphine, as he did every day. And what does Hitler do? Hitler at that point is on all kinds of drugs. He's on barbiturates, he's on a meth injection, he's taking pig liver extract, which isn't very good for a vegetarian. He's taking, what's it called? Udokil. It's quite a strange opiate because it's a euphoric opiate. For whatever reason, it seems to make you really excited as well. So yeah, Ukadal is called. Göring is very paranoid, and the infantry are Prussian division, and the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, is Nazi. And basically, Göring says to Hitler, if you let the infantry capture Dunkirk and wipe out these 340,000 men, then the generals, the success will go to their head and they'll be uncontrollable. And we don't want these Prussians to do that. We want to give the glory to Luftwaffe. So, poised on the edge of victory, Hitler agrees to this because Hitler is also paranoid, probably partly because of all the meth that he was on. And yeah, so he calls a halt to the advance, which gives the Allies enough time to organise the Dunkirk evacuations. The French general can't believe what's happening. No one understands why they have just, foregone this victory. But the war was nearly over in a few weeks. Fortunately, that much drugs used in that foolish a way makes you very, very bad at decision making. So they made a very, very bad decision. They called it the Luftwaffe, even though it was cloudy, even though there were Spitfires in the air, and the 340,000 men managed to escape. And that was the first of Hitler's appalling strategic decisions that he made. Absolutely fried. The guy was on up to 25 pills a day. He took 90 different drugs throughout the Second World War. His decision to invade Russia, that was never going to work. So basically, he thought what he could do to the Ardennes, to Belgium, he could do to Russia. Like, you can't. And they ended up, his troops ended up in summer uniforms, literally freezing to death, boiling their boots for sustenance, and then freezing to death into statues. There's a bit at the end of the war, I think it's 1944, where, no, it's 1943, it's the Berliner meeting between Mussolini and Hitler, and Mussolini wants to get out of the war, and he goes to this meeting, and one of Hitler's generals says about Hitler at that point, he was a bent figure with a pale, sunken face, collapsed in his chair, trembling hands hiding his vilely twitching left arm. That was the state of Hitler at that point. Then he took a big dose of Eucadal, and he became fresh, lively, inspiring, impulsive, and in excellent health. And then he talked at Mussolini for 3 hours without pausing for breath. Mussolini couldn't get a word in edgeways. All he could do was receive reports of the bombing of Rome that was happening as he was in this meeting, and hear about the imminent victory of the fascist forces by this raving, drug-fueled dude. Not dude. 6 days later, Mussolini gets arrested, and so that's the end of that. That's the end of the fascist alliance. 1944, there's another attempt to take the Ardennes, which was also did failure. So this is kind of what happens when you extract a drug. You extract a chemical from its entourage in a plant. You extract a plant from its culture. It's not like you remove the gods from the battlefield, because Hitler certainly had an interest in the spirits. What Jung said about this is very interesting. He writes an article about this, about Odin, the return of Odin, basically. And he says that when the gods are ignored or repressed, they become diseases. And he talks about the spontaneous emergence of this crazed trickster god, which then drives the Nazi party to this lunacy. Yeah, and then
I actually just wanted to ask you again, because your previous knowledge. Do you know much about the D-1X that they produced towards the end of the war? Do you want to give us a quick comment on that?
Yeah, so that was a mix of cocaine, I keep forgetting the word, Eucadil, and meth. So it's those three things.
Cocaine.
And cocaine. Yeah, so that was given to, right at the end of the war, well, they were using that at various points, but right at the end of the war, they use it in these one-man, basically torpedo submarines, which are a desperate attempt to try and break the blockade that the British had that was starving the country, because they couldn't get any food in at that point. So they have these one-man torpedoes, they fill people up with, how do you say it?
D-1X.
Yeah, they also, I think probably the saddest image of the Third Reich. The Third Reich was meant to last 1,000 years, right? It lasted just over 10. And at the end of it, you had Hitler Youth boys as young as 10 who were given gold fish embroidered onto a cap and a stick of cocaine chewing gum, and then put in these little torpedo boats. Most of them drowned like cats in bags. Yeah, so that's where it ends up, that war.
You can kind of see that being a perfect solution. A bunch of guys in a room doing drugs endlessly going, I've seen more drugs. So it's just my observation.
The quest for a truth serum doesn't end with the Nazis, right? There's a guy called Leo Alexander who collects a file on chemical manipulation of the will that's meant to be submitted to Nuremberg trials, but it gets stolen by operatives from Operation Paperclip. And that ends up in the CIA, so the CIA end up doing acid research. The first experiment is 1951, if I'm not mistaken, on American soil. It looks like at Dachau they were already buying, in fact, they were buying ergotamine tartrate, enough for 2,500 doses. This guy Richard Kuhn, who became the leader of the Max Planck Institute later. So that research is already going. There's mescaline research already going, and other substances. And it gets picked up by the CIA, who then start running a load of experiments in the US. And they're doing things like the nastiest of them is where they're giving the inmates of a hospital, a mental hospital, opiates, putting them into a coma for a month, and then giving them up to 77 days of acid in a locked room, playing them tapes up to 500,000 times. And the tapes say things like, you never got on with your mother, you don't get on with women, playing you just negging stuff, and then switching it to say, you're a really lively person, people get on with you. So those are the kind of experiments the CIA were doing covert, but they were also funding a whole bunch of other research programs, and a lot of them involved quite funky hippies as well. So you had marriage counselling programs with drugs, you had drug rehab programs, for example, where Bill Burroughs and Chet Baker, the jazz pianist, were playing, also funded by the CIA, because the CIA were collecting data from all of these different things. They were funding conferences, They were funding conferences, and they were funding research at the same place that's doing research, the same place that's doing research today. So you've got Johns Hopkins, who were funded by the CIA. You've got NYU, and where else have you got? MIT, which is, they're kind of leading the psychedelic renaissance today in their research. My question is, where does this all end up when we get to organisations like, can we talk about MAPS for a bit? We've got a few minutes to talk about MAPS. So MAPS, who I used to give money to, are now, they took funding from the Mercers, which is like Christian evangelical gun nuts, who donated their cash also to Breitbart, who have a major stake in Cambridge Analytica, which are the guys who influenced the elections of Brexit, for one thing, and also the Trump election. I think that was 2016. Steve Bannon's organisation, that is, white supremacists, and the Koch money as well, who support right-wing think tanks. So the Koch's got their money from taking oil off indigenous lands, and they're giving cash to MAPS. And they're not giving cash to MAPS out of the love of their heart, right? Why is MAPS so interested in MDMA? They used to talk about being a non-profit pharmaceuticals organisation which is focused on treating veterans, but they're not just treating veterans, right? There was a festival, South by Southwest, where there was a track sponsored by the US Army, RTX, that used to be Raytheon, Collins Ballistics, where Rick Doblin was the keynote speaker, where he said that MDMA can be used to improve battlefield performance. And he said that often servicemen, when they join the military, come from difficult backgrounds, and we can give them some MDMA when they enlist, so they can better handle whatever they need on the battlefield. It's kind of interesting, because that's not really what I wanted to do when I was on MDMA, shoot people. But imagine this, you go and join up, you get a big dose of MDMA with your comrades and your brothers in arms. Imagine how much love you would have for them. And oxytocin, we talk about, Rick Doblin talks about how it's the hormone of love in nursing mothers. Oxytocin, you look at the research on oxytocin, here's a little quote. In one study involving multi-round economic contest game between groups of attackers and defenders, oxytocin did not make attackers less aggressive. Instead, it enabled them to better coordinate their attacks. Attackers who used an oxytocin nasal spray were better at attacking their rivals' defensive strategies. The attackers timed their strikes to occur when their rivals were more vulnerable. And there was another research project which was about the trolley problem. You know the trolley problem? Where there's a train, it's about to run over 5 people unless you pull a lever, in which case it runs over 1 person. And so there was an oxytocin study done in Holland, If that guy is called Martin, or Piotr, or a Dutch name, a certain number of people are likely to kill him. If that guy is called Yusuf or Mohammed, more people are likely to kill him. If you give them oxytocin, they're even more likely to kill Mohammed than they were when they're on oxytocin. So one of the interesting things about oxytocin is that it promotes love of your own group, but it also promotes the boundaries, let's say. It promotes the edges. We're all the way back to the story of Yahweh here, who encourages you to love your friends and to hate your enemies. Yeah, so I want to know why MAPS are so interested in MDMA. I want to know why Rick was, in 2013, sought a trial MDMA on active soldiers with PTSD. There was a conference in Ukraine just recently, what was that, 2023, where those in military service who bear significant psychological burdens were the subjects of this. And we're not talking about veterans here, we're talking about people who are active soldiers taking MDMA and getting back to the front, which is also what the $27 million grant that went to DARPA to make non-psychoactive, non-psychedelic LSD. I forget the name of the guy who ran that experiment, but he was saying, yeah, this is really good, it's just like a depression pill, you know, you can take it, you're not depressed anymore, which is really, really useful in the situation of warfare. Right? PTSD isn't a disorder. You're meant to feel bad when you're involved in a massacre. So, yeah, I guess what I would like to finish up saying, I know I've spoken loads and probably far too much, subject close to my heart, is we're already at war. Right? There's a massacre going on, and MAPS is ran a conference in Tel Aviv. Some better organisations dropped out of it because it's a disgusting thing to run a conference on resolving trauma whilst you're massacring a civilian population. We're already at war. War ends up with absolute atrocities like those 10-year-olds being drowned in little submarines. And the psychedelic underground has been not doing stuff like that for a very long time. Indigenous groups have been doing their best to fight without absolutely annihilating each other for a very long time. And now the military seems to have got hold of our culture and our people. And capital interests are all over the place, and some of the funders of MAPS and Lycos with this $100 million, convicted fraudsters and all the rest. I guess the question is, for people in the underground, when it comes to war, which side are we on?
Brilliant points there. I think just to kind of put an exclamation mark on this, there were MDMA pressed pills found in Germany recently with SS iconography on. We all tend to have this, I've taken this experience. I mean, MDMA, obviously, as you're speaking of, facilitating the underground in California, it was like the love drug used in like marital relations, etc. Because you have a positive experience, if you think of it that way. But like I said, it's bonding with the tribe, and then in that sense of heightened euphoria, the other, if it's not in the group, they're by nature out of the group. And I think this is what the military-industrial complex is starting to understand. As we move towards late-stage capitalism, warfare is becoming more inevitable. You look at the funding that's happening in European nations, and everyone preparing for World War III, whatever that looks like. But to counter that again, we're seeing a re-emergence of underground sort of cultures and movements like the Free Party scene. Everybody's seen the papers recently, a lot of rigs around the country and a bunch of teens getting together. They're doing the same thing on the opposite end of the spectrum. When we don't have these third spaces and these places to congregate together, these substances facilitate socialization. I mean, there's that famous experiment with octopuses, gave them MDMA, and a generally very antisocial creature actually sought each other out for socialization. We're not beyond reproach or repair. The war is upon us, exactly as you stated, Danny. But I think that the means to our salvation and the ability to sort of find a ceasefire, as it were, isn't by us meeting them on their battle lines. It's by us meeting together in rooms like this and finding out how we, support each other and create synergy into, creating a better world. Final thoughts, and then we'll probably grab one or two questions before we get kicked out of here. Jump straight to questions, and Neil, question.
Thank you. it's such an honour to be in the presence of someone that's got so much knowledge, and well, everyone here has a lot of knowledge, but I'm really grateful to have just been able to absorb so much of what you shared. With all the Indigenous practices and warfares and things that you shared at the start, which was beautiful to learn from all these different places. When our people were mentioned, the people of this rock that we're on, that was coming in as the colonisers and the oppressors at a certain point in time. I just want to ask about your feelings of your own indigeneity as someone that's gone all around the world, bringing it back to yourself, because echoing what you said, it's about us here in the West connecting with our own sense of indigeneity that is really going to get some shit happening. Like Fela Kuti's son said on a big stage somewhere, it's about, we're saying save Palestine, save Sudan, save all these places, but he was saying save Europe, because it's the consciousness of these folks in Europe that needs to adapt so that we can look at these Indigenous practices around the world and see ourselves in it. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that, maybe your own journey, your own connection with where you come from. I don't really know where that is. You said Hastings earlier, but so I think there's a question there somewhere.
Thank you for the question. I really like it. It's spot on. I think England was probably colonised before Scotland. And we're all, my background is Jewish, Eastern European Jewish, right? So my family has seen the nasty end of empire, definitely, and I have family who are now involved in the nasty end of empire as it plays out in the tortured land of Palestine. Empire and let's say oppression is a wheel that is rolling over all of us, and like the karmic wheel, we can either keep pushing it or we can step back from it and leave it to to slow at least. And when Hitler invaded Russia, for example, it was never going to work. There was never one point in history where he was ever going to get to Moscow and destroy it, right? But there was not much, the wise thing to do, which was basically what they did, although Stalin did it quite badly, was to retreat until they froze to death in their summer uniforms, right? And I think that's kind of where I feel like where we should be at the moment. I don't feel like, I was involved in Occupy, I've been involved in loads of protest movements. I think they have their moment. But I feel like, what you said, it's about our own space, it's about cultivating our own, I don't want to say rules, our own cultures in our own spaces between the cracks of this cracking system where we're going to preserve something which can survive the tempest that is passing over us, and when it emerges organically, like it did in the football firms of the 1980s, like there were some really rough football hoolies then, and they got into ecstasy, and you had Millwall and Arsenal fans hugging on the dance floor, right? It's not hard to do MDMA right. You just have to not be a government with an agenda to, keep us hating each other. Like, organically, we can work these things out. The hippies didn't have a great deal of knowledge passed on to them from indigenous tribes, but they worked out how to be cool with each other and how to communicate with each other and how to communicate with the spirits, You asked me about my own story. My story was going to Brazil, curious about, I got involved in ayahuasca because my girlfriend at the time, who was later my ex-wife, said to me, "There's a crazy drugs party, do you want to go?" And I went, "Yeah." It's ayahuasca. "Oh, I've heard of that. Okay." And when I arrived, it was, you know, men on one side, women on the other, suits and crosses and all this. I was like, where the hell am I? You know, and I wandered into this very strange cultural container, and then I became fascinated by it, completely fascinated by it. This is an emergent indigenous tradition from the edge of empire, and it spread all over the whole world, you know. So I was curious about learning about that culture. And when I got ill, as I mentioned before, everyone around me thought I was crazy trying to treat with ayahuasca. They were saying, "Go and get your injections. You're going to die. We're going to have this like dead gringo, or this disfigured gringo, and everyone's going to be in trouble." Right? So my own journey was to follow the instructions of the brew itself, but more than that, the spirits. Right? The spirits talk to you if you listen. If you admit the possibility of them existing, like people have entertained that idea for always, pretty much everywhere until the last few hundreds here, which is the same last 200 years where we start rolling over the entire world with this colonial project. Right? If you open your ears to them, they're there, they're talking. So that's what I did, and people thought I was crazy. So that was my experience, was starting to listen to those people and to those invisible people, and then to translate what they say as best as I can in places like this.
Good answer. I think I'd quite like to answer as well. I think that we have evidence, obviously, of a lot of indigenous long-term traditional use of various different, plant medicines and derivatives and sort of activities and practices around them. I think the thing that we're missing here, kind of in the UK, on this little rock of ours, we'll include our neighbours in Ireland, and with the Celtic sort of tradition and whatnot, with pagans, far beyond monotheistic sort of, prior to the monotheistic period we live in now, kind of we have a synergy with nature, with ancestral worship, things like that. It's quite contentious to talk about some of the compounds that are believed to have been here in the UK because we don't have direct evidence for it. I think cannabis we've managed to date back to about the year 700 odd with Viking settlements, but it's likely believed to have been here a long time before that. Obviously there are a multitude of psilocybin-containing mushrooms that are indigenous here to the UK as well, so we will have had a history and heritage of traditional culture and practice. We've just had it severed from us. We had the Dark Ages obviously over here, and this kind of before the creation of like this division of this twinned dance of modern science and modern theology, kind of using science as, oh, God give us that science kind of thing, and they self-justify and whatnot. We basically have to rediscover it ourselves. The traditional use in the UK is sniffing coke and talking shit in somebody's kitchen at 4 a.m. Do you know what I mean? It's raving off your face on MDMA in a field to a festival that you snuck in over the fence. It's picking mushrooms wild in the autumn and eating them with friends around a fire. We define and we create our own. We don't need to be kind of, hamstringed by peer pressure, which is, tradition of, which is kind of peer pressure from dead people. We don't know those, we're not connected to them in a lot of ways right now. What we can do is look around the world and go, actually this plus this. Okay, how do we incorporate that with us? Different history and culture of our practices and traditions, and I think that's what we're kind of seeing in the other side of the Renaissance. People like Rick Doblin's going around the world talking about psychedelic Renaissance, but they're talking about it through a neoliberal, capitalist, global, colonial, sort of imperial mindset of literally trying to colonize the mind of when you can have access to these substances, but we control the gateway of God. And frankly, nobody gets to define my relationship with the larger entity that permeates the force, the universe. So I think, yes, we have to go and discover our own and recreate it within the UK, within traditional practice, because what's done up here in Scotland is going to be different from Durham. What's going to be different in Wales, I often quip that if you take Welsh liberty caps, they are the single most emotional compound on the planet. Don't know why, they just are. You take liberty caps from my end, always make me laugh. Right, do you know what I mean? There's a nature, a heritage, a history, like you were saying before. The spirits speak, the molecules speak. It's just we've lost the ears to hear, the eyes to see. Not to be too cliche with it, you know what I mean? But we rediscover that together, and then you've got your mate who go, dude, check this out. And that's what we're doing, and we might not be living through that period where the tribes recognized, you know, the conquistadors and these colonizers as enemy and unified together. They're coming at us going, you want ketamine? We'll sell you ketamine. You want cannabis? We'll sell you cannabis. Don't you dare grow cannabis. Don't you dare take ketamine with your friends. Like, do you know what I mean? They are controlling our relationship with this, and I think it's necessary for each of us to, in our own way, cultivate our relationship with these things and to come back to the group and go, look what I found.
Yeah, just to put a little point on that, you could wipe out all the shamans in the world, but you're not going to wipe out those spirits because they're not alive nor dead. They're not dead anyway, right? Or they're not dying. They don't die. They're waiting to talk to you. They really are. They're desperate to have conversations. They like flesh. They like us, and they like people who are interested in them as well. So, you know.
Yeah, kind of hide the truth even if you hide the people to tell it. So that was a bit more condensed than we would have liked. I think I'd like to invite him onto my podcast so you and I can do this over several hours, because I think there's far more that I'd like to delve in with you in a topic here. But yeah, this has been a pleasure. Do we have any more questions? I don't see anybody rushing to kick us out yet. Do we have one last question?
I have a question. I completely agree with you. One of the little bit like maybe devil's advocate and ask kind of what your comments, thoughts are regarding these kind of organisations, for example, like MAPS and the work in maybe educating, making these things more accessible, and if you think it's all bad or like...
No, it's...
Like, I do completely agree about the capitalism, like they're wanting to get their hands in the money, but...
It's not an artificial binary, right? No, should it be, but they try and tell us that it is. These mushrooms every year say celebrity capital, waves, etc. will pop up around this country no matter. We don't have to like go and ask somebody, they will just happen. If you have the knowledge, you can go and procure them. And for a long time we kept this esoteric knowledge sort of together, and then what happened is a lot of people went off like goblins and went and got degrees and went, I'm going to spend my life's work doing X, Y, Z. Along the way, that genuine sincerity and authenticity, I believe, is captured by capital interest, and then it becomes, no, this will exist, but only in the pharmaceutical model. We've seen this as cannabis has been rolled out. There's now 100,000 odd prescribers, 100,000 odd patients, in the UK, about 43 odd clinics, less than 5 prescriptions on the NHS for the children who actually need cannabis. So these private clinics are profiteering. Yet the 20 odd plants I've got at my house in Durham, that would land me in a prison cell for 7 years. So if I buy it from them, I'm protected by their racket. So we can be aware that their knowledge has to be correct to a certain degree. When we read their studies, when we assess their data, that has to be stringently, academically standardized, which means we can also use that data. Don't let their narratives get caught up in the fact, look at that man in his shiny suit, he clearly knows what he's doing. I don't need to look into this. Of course you do. You may have something in you that changes the entire direction of this conversation. The people that loudest speak that they are leading us to the new frontier are the ones I'm most suspicious of. The people that have worked with these compounds and have traveled and experienced these cultures and whatnot around the world, there's a humility that comes to it, that once you've spoken to it, your ego is still there, obviously, but in the modern sort of parlance of this default mode network, you're not in this, what can I get from it? It's what can I give? And you flip the script. And so I think a lot of these people, that kind of ego gets massaged and gets kind of entertained when they're flying around the world first class and they're speaking at a conference stage with 10 grand payment or whatever, then they're not really thinking of the poor lads in Glasgow housing estate that are going to get the bus out to the fields later and pick some mushrooms. That doesn't factor into it.
Yeah, well, speaking of humility, this is my second book, Neuro-Apoclaypse. It's really good. This is my first book, Science Revealed. It's really good. And this one I made with my own fair hands the other day. It's called Myth, Magic and Medicine. To answer your question, there have been good things going on at conferences, most certainly. I was involved in every breaking convention since the first one, until the last one, when I got kicked out in 2023. They didn't tell me why I was kicked out. I'm pretty sure I know why I was kicked out. But they wouldn't even let me go to the debrief afterwards I was the ethics lead, right? I was the ethics lead during the ethical decisions they made on whether they were going to take funding from MAPS, who was funded by the Mercers and all these monsters, and what they were going to have to do in return for that. They didn't ask me about those things. They didn't ask me a single ethical question the entire time I was there, and then they kicked me out before I was allowed to go to the debrief, where I could ask them, why are you doing a whip around just after the conference for a MAPS meeting in the Ukraine, where they're going to be inviting a colonel from the Dutch army whose research is in novel PTSD treatments on soldiers to get them back to the front, right? I was going to do a talk on war on psychedelics at MAPS, not MAPS, they wouldn't have me, Breaking Convention 2020, what was it, 4 or 5, I forget which one. First time I've never spoken, because they wouldn't accept my talk, because they didn't want me to go and talk about war on psychedelics. I think I know quite a few things about war on psychedelics, but they didn't want to hear them, right? So when I left, I made some recommendations, and I asked them, why haven't you had Indigenous representation for 3 years at Breaking Convention? 3 years, right? So yeah, is it all bad? No, it could be great. We could get some Indigenous people along. Well, I said to them, why didn't you get some Indigenous people along? We couldn't find one, right? I run a reforestation company which works with Indigenous people. I'm on the phone to Indigenous people quite often. They say, oh, we couldn't find a translator. I speak Portuguese, I lived there, right? I was the ethics lead, right? So I would love to think, who did they have at the last Breaking Convention? I had to sit through and moderate this dude, Elliot, who was their accountant, who was talking about so the question was whether it would make better economic sense to do an individual MDMA therapy session or a group therapy session. And he said, well, it doesn't really matter because the biggest cost anyway is the MDMA, which works out as 25 on the, it works out as 25 million on the key, basically. That's how much they're selling MDMA for, right? Literally, I sat there trying to, carrying the zero for ages, trying to work out if I've got match. It's 25 million on the key, right? That's quite a markup. Why? Because it has to be super pure, because it needs to be FDA approved and blah, blah, blah. You don't need super pure MDMA to get someone through an MDMA therapy session. I can say from maybe experience, it doesn't need to be that pure, just give them a little bit more. It's a racket. It's a total racket. And they're not, listen, I have a ton of privilege, right? I'm a white, well-spoken person, and I got kicked out of Breaking Convention, yeah? Because I got something of a critique, and they haven't had an Indigenous person for ages. Now they've got some now, but for 3 years they didn't, So, and this is, so what I would have said to them had they let me speak was, I think I would have cited Article 12 of the Geneva Convention. Members of the armed forces who are wounded or sick shall not be subjected to biological experiments. Article 32 prohibits scientific experiments not necessitated by the medical treatment of a protected person. Protected people are soldiers in combat, like the Ukrainian soldiers in combat, right? I don't think, when I was giving my heart and soul and money and time to break the convention, I didn't think it was the Geneva Convention that they were going to be breaking.
Should drop a mic on that one.
Can I ask you a question? I've been trying to follow the MDMA therapy and what they're actually going to charge for treating PTSD. And the initial figures I got for 2 therapists was they're thinking somewhere around the lines of 12,000 American, and it went up to 15,000 American. Before you could blank, 20,000 American. And that just seems like it's
that's probably on the cheaper end, I'm afraid.
Are you joking?
No.
That's just credible.
But it's a supply demand. I mean, a big thing that Rick was doing prior to then changing the structure of the company into a for-profit was basically trying to get the Veterans Fund, was trying to go, can we get one branch of government to pay the other branch of government and the peeps in the middle? And it became convoluted because obviously Americans have an insurance-based system. If you suddenly give to one, it's a slippery slope. What about the next group and the next group? And we can't be giving people free healthcare. And I think it's one of the reasons why they end up changing and going, well, the veterans, they're already costing us bloody money. They're going to let them cost them more. But if you're young enough and you go back in that battlefield, ooh, your value. Do you know what I mean? If you can return that future value, it's sickening. I mean, in the UK, for example, cannabis came down the first few months for a few £1,000s in clinics for access to oil. Similar products now, £500 to £1,000. You can probably knocked off a couple of grand there. Ketamine in the UK started as well at somewhere in the region of £5,000 a session. I think London's got it down to around a grand. And it'll go to a baseline, obviously, because it's all the middlemen. Like I said, the reason it costs 25 million is they've got some guy wrote a policy that says the fridge that it has to be contained in has to contain this metal and be bought from that company in Switzerland and forged in the fires of Mont Doom and, like, you know what I mean? But it's so everybody gets to drink, it's jobs for the boys. It's frustrating. I think in a lot of ways this is only ever going to go towards single patented compounds, and it won't even be methylamphetamine as we know it. It'll be some other, we tweaked a carbon molecule here, we tweaked a whatever. We took away that euphoric feeling, because it just gets messy amongst you and the therapist.
And also uses like, speaking of patents, another one of breaking conventions, profound sponsors. They released figures on how much they gave, and they didn't tell me when I was the ethics lead how much they were giving. But is Beckley, and you know, rest her soul. Amanda Fielding also had a company that was patenting. I think it patented 8 medical uses of cannabis, whilst her class allies were keeping it illegal. You know, this is a traditional medicine that's been around, well, as I say, in these isles since, 700, probably longer? Yeah. So now the British aristocracy, Lady Knightsworth was patenting access to that. You know? So you can probably get it cheaper somewhere in Durham.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at sort of the protocols of it, what they're going to give you is the reason that they argue it needs to be in such a strong therapeutic setting. Basically, they're taking you to a baseline and giving you from a controlled variable. Whereas you then take MDMA at a house party or at a festival or whatever, there's so many other things that can bring you up, send you sideways, trigger temporary psychosis type events, etc. It's also then, it's what are they wanting to reconstruct you in that space for?
Yes.
Like, as I said before about controlling access to the profound, there's all sorts of protocols that was put in place. Granted, we've got a lot better now about male-female practitioners, because a lot of these compounds, they can evoke quite really strong and archaic emotional responses. And if you're in that kind of therapeutic setting, you know what I mean, there was already that, what word am I looking for here, it's escaping me. You're starting from a blank slate. You're not you going through the experiences of where you in the hospital going through it. Do you know what I mean? And so then anything you kind of bring up isn't the same as you made for 10 years, that you walk off to go to a fire on the second day of a festival or whatever, and you're suddenly talking about that trauma of you being abused as a child. Do you know what I mean? For some people, they can only talk to people they love, they can only connect with people they care about. And if you want to then give them a drug like this that allows them and facilitates that, and they're suddenly seeing these two cold, sober, you know, I did 15 years of education, I did 20 years of education. It's like, how many of you have tripped? How many of you can you understand what I'm feeling right now? Not put it into cold academic science and terms, but so basically what I'm saying is I'm obviously can't really say take drugs, but there are many services in the UK and a lot of home testing kits where you can test the quality and potency of the street available MDMA. There are protocols that you can find, videos you can watch on YouTube. There are even trip sitting services as well. You can maybe cobble together your own kind of access point that way. Be very mindful of the people you work with. There's a lot of charlatans in the space. I think my final point to surmise kind of the MAPS thing and the conflict here is the same quote that I used when we spoke on Monday about sort of drug law and the difference, nuance between legal and lawful, is an Upton Sinclair quote: "You cannot expect a man to understand something when his salary is contingent on him not understanding it." If you're in the psychedelic space, if you're in the medical cannabis, so-called bastardization of the term, but if you're in these industrial complexes, your paycheck, your continuation of your career, the advancement of where you are is contingent on you aligning with the beliefs and the structure of that which you operate in.
And there's a really good example of that, I think, if you look at Lycos, right? So Lycos got its 100 million from Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation, they got busted for the biggest insider trading scandal ever. They got a $1.8 billion fine on that one. True Ventures, who are into therapeutic novel RNA medicine, so enough said about that. And Vine Ventures, right? So Vine Ventures were the guys who paid for the research or paid for the study that was meant to take MDMA to FDA approval. And when that stuff was analysed, it turned out that there was a whole load of scientific mismanagement. So functional unblinding, basically, they knew what was MDMA, what wasn't. Dismissal of negative data, right? So people were reporting feeling suicidal, and they were saying, no, we won't put that down. Coaching and biasing by therapists. The moral conflict of people. They were giving more sessions, more integration sessions to the people who had MDMA than the people who didn't have MDMA, and trying to pass that off as a scientific experiment, and then mishandling of the sexual misconduct and trying to cover it up as well, right? So exactly that, if the research is funded by a for-profit corporation that is putting tons of money in it, they're going to want it to work, and I guess we're pretty lucky that they caught it on the way through. Something you said was really interesting in the language you used just before was that some of these things, they evoke pretty powerful archaic forces, right? Evoke is a word that comes straight out of the occult. Those forces are gods, and even if the research, even the science was done really well, even if everybody was really well meaning about it, everywhere else that we've used psychedelics, and even things like tobacco, things which aren't thought of as psychedelic, they've had gods involved, and what have we got? We've got these. Actually, I think the last time they gave a talk at Breaking Convention was the one they did at the cinema, the cinema in London. I can't remember what it's called, but they put they had a panel called Churches versus Clinicians. And it was they were all kind of contentious. And they put me against this guy who said, we had the opportunity to use an ECT room, like electroconvulsive shock therapy room. It was really good in the hospital because it didn't have any noisy machinery, and so we decorated it with flowers, and we put this gold infinity orb on the wall. Isn't this a lovely way to kind of, import some of the indigenous sentiments into the room? And I said to him, the first thing that any traditional practitioner would do in a room that would be used for electroconvulsive shock therapy would be an exorcism. But it just didn't enter their minds that there could be something bigger than them in the universe, right? And it's not very, it's kind of uncool to compare people to Nazis. But I think that's kind of what went wrong with Hitler's strategic decisions, where it was just him and no one else than him, the Ubermensch.
This has been a pleasure. Like I said, I'm definitely one of our legal podcasts so we can continue this conversation. I think for people that obviously enjoyed it as well, where can they buy your book or books?
Oh, they get this one. Thank you for saying that. Science Revealed. Get it on Amazon. It's on Psychedelic Press. Neuro-Apoclaypse. You can get it on. We didn't even start my slides. I've got another 2 hours if you want to keep going. DannyNemu.com, and you'll find them on there.